My name is Joanna. For 12 long years I poured every drop of my soul, every sleepless night, and every sacrifice into building a $75 million empire. I believed that my hard work was the language of my love for my family, but at a dinner table filled with the clinking of fine crystal and hollow laughter, I realized the truth. To my father, I wasn't the architect of his success. I was merely a placeholder. He smiled as he handed my life's work to my brother, Ethan, as if I had never existed. Perhaps you too have known the crushing weight of being overlooked or the silent ache of a betrayal from those you trusted most. This is a story for everyone who has been told they aren't enough, and for every soul currently fighting a battle they haven't spoken of. It is a journey of reclaiming power, not with noise, but with the elegant, quiet strength of a woman who finally learned to see her own value. Before we begin this journey together, I want to express my deepest, most humble gratitude to you for being here. It is a true privilege to share these words with you. If this story touches your heart or stirs the strength within your own spirit, I invite you to subscribe to Queen's Revenge. Your presence here is what makes this channel a sanctuary for those of us reclaiming our thrones. And to those of you who have already joined our family, thank you for walking beside me. My sincere wish for you is a life overflowing with an abundance of wealth, a spirit filled with true happiness, and the unwavering courage to always own the room you walk into. Welcome to Queen's Revenge. Let the story begin. The chandelier above the mahogany dining table hummed with a light that felt far too clinical for a celebration. It cast sharp, unforgiving shadows across the faces of the Harper family, and the select group of board members invited to witness our supposed triumph. The scent of roasted lamb and vintage Cabernet filled the room, a fragrance that usually signaled victory, but tonight, it smelled like an antiseptic for a wound that hadn't been opened yet. I sat at my father's right hand, a position I had earned through 12 years of relentless expansion, sleepless nights in Singaporean ports, and the brutal restructuring of our logistics network. Harper & Company was no longer the struggling regional firm my father had started. It was a monolithic entity valued at $75 million, a figure that had been confirmed only that morning by the auditors. I felt the weight of that number in my bones. It was the price of my youth, the cost of every relationship I had let wither, and the singular monument to my existence. My father, James Harper, stood up, his wine glass held aloft. He looked every bit the patriarch, his silver hair groomed to perfection, his suit tailored to hide the fact that he hadn't stepped into a warehouse in a decade. He looked at me with a pride that I now realize was purely performative, a veneer for the guests. Across the table, my brother Ethan sat with a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. Ethan, who had spent the last 3 years finding himself on a yacht in the Mediterranean while I was negotiating the acquisition of the Northern Rail Corridor. I had noticed Marcus Thorne, my father's personal estate attorney, lurking in the mahogany-paneled hallway when I arrived. Marcus didn't do celebrations. He did transfers, wills, and divestments. Seeing him was the first crack in the evening's facade. I knew then that this dinner wasn't a coronation for the architect of the $75 million empire. It was an execution. To Harper & Company, my father began, his voice resonant and commanding, the voice of a man who believed he owned the air in the room. Today we hit a milestone that many thought impossible. 12 years ago we were a footnote in the logistics industry. Today we are the headline. He paused, letting the murmurs of approval from the board members wash over him. I felt a surge of pride, despite the nagging dread in my gut. I had been the one to implement the automated tracking systems. I had been the one to pivot us toward green hydrogen fleet options before the subsidies even hit the market. I was the engine. But as we look toward the next century of this company, he continued, his smile widening into something predatory, it is time for a new generation of leadership. It is time for a son of the Harper bloodline to take the helm. To my son Ethan, your new CEO. May you lead us to the next 100 million. The sound of the glasses clinking following his toast sounded like a death knell. It was the sound of iron doors slamming shut. The silence that followed in my own mind was absolute. My heart sank into a cold, dark place, but my face remained an obsidian mask. I had spent years in boardrooms with men who wanted to see me falter. I would not give them the satisfaction now. I felt the eyes of the board members, men I had made wealthy, flicker toward me, searching for the crack, the tear, the scream. Instead, I lifted my glass. My hand was a statue. I smiled back at my father, a perfect practiced expression of filial support that masked the fact that I was already mentally dismantling every legal protection he thought he had. Ethan's smirk broke into a triumphant grin as he stood to accept the congratulations. He looked at me, and for a second the mask slipped on his end. It wasn't just about the company for him. It was about the humiliation. He wanted to see me reduced to a footnote. My father's hand rested proudly on Ethan's shoulder, a gesture of intimacy he hadn't offered me since I was a child. "Your brother will take over on Monday, Joanna," my father said, leaning toward me, his breath smelling of expensive grapes and betrayal. "You've done a wonderful job as a placeholder, truly. But a company of this scale needs a different kind of presence. You can stay on as a consultant, of course, to help him learn the ropes. A placeholder. 12 years of my life, distilled into a temporary arrangement." He spoke as if I had been babysitting the firm while the real heir was away playing. What he didn't realize, and what Ethan was too arrogant to see, was that I hadn't spent those 12 years just running the business. I had been weaving myself into its very DNA. In 2017, when the company faced a liquidity crisis due to his ill-advised expansion into the Brazilian market, it was my private capital funds I had earned through independent consulting and early-stage tech investments that kept the lights on. I hadn't asked for a repayment. I had asked for convertible debt notes, signed in the middle of the night when he was too desperate to read the fine print regarding dilution protection and anti-embarrassment clauses. The technicality of my revenge began to take shape in my mind as the second course was served. My father believed he still held the 60% majority because the cap table in the annual report still listed him as such. But he had forgotten the 2019 restructuring. I had insisted on an executive performance equity program that triggered additional voting shares if the company's valuation exceeded $50 million for 3 consecutive quarters. We had just cleared that hurdle. Because I had managed the filings myself, and because my father viewed the legal paperwork as administrative clutter, he never noticed the shift. He was a man of the old world, believing that a name on the door was the same thing as a lock on the gate. I watched Ethan boast to the head of the board about his visionary plans for the company, plans that involved selling off our most profitable regional hubs to fund a luxury lifestyle division. He was going to gut the company I had built to buy himself more yachts. I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over me. The pain was gone, replaced by a calculated, mathematical fury. My father smiled at me again, perhaps thinking that my silence was a sign of brokenness. He didn't know that I was already calculating the exact moment to trigger the change of control provisions in our top-tier contracts. He didn't know that by Monday morning, Ethan wouldn't be inheriting a throne. He would be inheriting a legal minefield where I held all the detonators. As the dinner wound down, I excused myself with a grace that left the room in awe of my professionalism. I walked past Marcus Thorne in the hall, the lawyer who had drafted the documents Ethan thought would crown him. I caught Marcus's eye and gave him a nod he didn't realize was a farewell to his own career. Given the malpractice suit I would be filing for his failure to disclose the equity shifts to his primary client. I stepped out into the cool night air, the city lights reflecting in my eyes like sparks from a forge. My father thought he had ended my career at that table. In reality, he had just given me the motivation to stop playing the daughter and start playing the owner. I wouldn't just take the company back. I would ensure that when I was done, the name Harper belonged to me alone, and they would be the ones seeking an invitation to the table. The drive home from the dinner was a blur of neon lights and cold, sharp clarity. As I stepped into my penthouse, the silence of the space felt like a sanctuary, a stark contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of the Harper estate. I didn't go to bed. Instead, I went straight to my home office, the room where the Betrayal Harper & Company had been built over the last 12 years. I sat in my ergonomic chair, the leather cool against my skin, and pulled up the digital archives of the 2017 and 2019 financial restructurings. To the world, and certainly to my father, these were mere bureaucratic hurdles, the boring paperwork handled by the reliable daughter while the men focused on the big picture. To me, they were the blueprints of a coup. The memory of 2017 hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was the year my father almost burned the empire to the ground. Driven by a reckless desire to prove his pioneer spirit, James Harper had over-leveraged the company to fund an aggressive expansion into the Brazilian logistics market, without accounting for the local regulatory volatility or the sheer cost of infrastructure. Within 8 months, Harper & Company was bleeding $2 million a month. We were on the verge of technical insolvency. My father spent his days in a daze of expensive scotch and panicked calls to old friends who suddenly didn't have time for him. Ethan, meanwhile, was in Ibiza, launching a blockchain-based concierge service that was essentially a black hole for company dividends. I remembered the night I walked into my father's study. He looked broken, his desk littered with notices of default. I didn't offer him a hug. I offered him a bridge loan. I had $5 million in private capital, amassed from high-stakes tech investments I'd made in my early 20s and private consulting fees. I told him I would bail the company out, but only if the transaction was handled through a structured mezzanine financing agreement. He was so desperate to avoid the public humiliation of bankruptcy that he didn't even consult an outside auditor. He let me, the loyal placeholder, draft the terms. I structured the loan as a convertible debt note. On the surface, it looked like a standard loan with a modest interest rate. However, buried deep within the events of default and capitalization adjustments clauses was a provision for an automatic conversion into Series A preferred stock at a pre-money valuation of $10 million. A fraction of what the company would eventually be worth. Because James believed the company was dying, he signed. He didn't see it as giving away his throne. He saw it as taking a lifeline from a daughter who would never dare use it against him. The years that followed were a masterclass in attrition. While Ethan's social media feed was a curated gallery of luxury watches and networking events on the French Riviera, my life was measured in shipping manifests and port labor negotiations. I lived in the hum of the server rooms and the grit of the loading docks. I transformed our aging fleet into an AI-driven logistics network that predicted supply chain bottlenecks before they happened. I was the one standing in a rain-slicked shipyard in Rotterdam at 3 a.m. to personally oversee the arrival of our first automated cargo shipment, while Ethan was likely sleeping off a hangover in a 5-star hotel paid for by the company's marketing and development budget. It was during those lonely, grueling hours that the internal realization finally solidified. I was a ghost in my own machine. No matter how many millions I added to the bottom line, no matter how many times I saved the firm from ruin, I was still just James's girl. To my father, competence was a tool, but gender was a destiny. He viewed my brilliance as a fortunate accident of birth, a temporary asset to be utilized until the rightful heir decided to stop playing. By 2019, the company had rebounded, and the valuation was climbing toward the $40 million mark. I knew I needed to fortify my position before the patriarch's hubris returned. I proposed the Executive Performance Equity Program, EPEP. I pitched it to my father as a way to align the interests of the executive team with long-term shareholder value. Corporate speak that he loved because it made us sound like a Silicon Valley titan. The EPEP was designed to issue new tranches of voting common stock, based on the achievement of specific, hyper-aggressive KPIs. A 20% reduction in operational overhead, the securing of 3 Tier 1 international contracts, and a sustained EBITDA margin of 25%. James, ever the traditionalist, assumed he would always be the majority holder simply because he was the founder. He didn't realize that the EPP contained a catch-up equity clause. This clause stated that if a single executive hit more than 90% of the aggregate targets alone, they would be entitled to a supervoting stock issuance to prevent hostile dilution from external investors. I was the only executive who stayed. I fired the deadweight and took on the roles of COO, CFO, and head of strategy simultaneously. I hit every target. By the time the paperwork was finalized, my placeholder equity had quietly ballooned. I remembered sitting across from my father in 2019 after the first successful audit of the new program. He was in high spirits, bragging about his company's recovery to a group of golfing buddies. He hadn't even read the quarterly capitalization table. Why would he? In his mind, I was his secretary with a fancy title, a loyal dog guarding his porch while he slept. He didn't understand that every late night I spent in the office wasn't just about the work. It was about the math. I was meticulously diluting his 60% stake with every milestone I hit, converting my 2017 debt notes and exercising my 2019 performance warrants. As I sat in my dark office now, staring at the screen, I saw the final result. James Harper 35%. Ethan Harper 5%, a pity gift from our father. Joanna Harper 60%. The math was indisputable. The legal framework was ironclad. My father's smiling face from the dinner tonight replayed in my mind, that patronizing, smug look as he told me Ethan would take over. He truly believed that a few words at a dinner table could undo 12 years of tactical brilliance. He thought he was playing a game of checkers based on tradition and blood. He didn't realize I had been playing a high-stakes game of corporate chess where I had already taken his queen, both his rooks, and was currently hovering over his king. I closed my laptop and felt a strange sense of peace. The placeholder was about to become the proprietor. Monday morning wouldn't be a transition of power. It would be a foreclosure. I had built the walls of this $75 million fortress, and I was the only one who knew that the keys in my father's hand no longer fit the locks. Tomorrow the world would learn that in the house of Harper, loyalty was a fairy tale, but equity was the only truth that mattered. The Monday morning air was crisp, biting with the promise of a seasonal shift, but inside the glass and steel monolith of Harper & Company headquarters, the atmosphere was stagnant with anticipation. I arrived at 6:45 a.m., nearly 2 hours before the general staff and 3 hours before my father and Ethan were scheduled to make their triumphant entrance. I wore a charcoal suit of such precise tailoring it felt like armor, my heels echoing against the white marble floors of the lobby. To the security guard at the desk, I was merely the hard-working daughter arriving early as usual. He didn't see the flash drive tucked into my palm or the cold fire behind my eyes. He didn't know that the woman walking past him was no longer an employee, but a sovereign state declaring war. Before leaving my penthouse, I had opened the hidden wall safe behind the mahogany paneling of my library. Inside lay the physical proof of my silent conquest, the original ink-signed copies of the 2015 restructuring deed and the 2017 convertible debt notes. I had spent an hour under the dim glow of a desk lamp rereading the change of control and negative pledge clauses. My father had viewed these documents as necessary evils to keep the bank's auditors away, dismissing the technical jargon as Joanna's legal hobbies. He never realized that by signing them, he had effectively turned over the keys to his kingdom to the person he considered his most loyal servant. I tucked the folders into my briefcase, a leather-bound guillotine for his ego, and headed to the office. Now, sitting at my desk in the dark, the city skyline beginning to bleed into a pale blue dawn, I began the silent activation of my protocol Pingamanon, the security protocols I had spent 3 years embedding into the company's digital infrastructure. I wasn't just the CEO. I was the one who had spearheaded our transition to a proprietary, cloud-based logistics OS. I knew every backdoor, every encryption key, and every administrative override. I logged into the core server with my Level 1 global admin credentials, access rights that my father had never bothered to learn, and that Ethan didn't even know existed. The first step was the digital vault isolation. With a series of keystrokes, I initiated a script that moved our most sensitive intellectual property, the predictive routing algorithms and the proprietary client interface codes, into a partitioned server. Legally, these assets were owned by a subsidiary I had formed in 2020, Harper Tech Solutions, which Harper & Company licensed for a nominal fee. My father had signed the licensing agreement because it looked better for tax purposes, never noticing that the contract allowed the licensor to suspend service without notice, in the event of an unauthorized change in executive leadership. If Ethan sat in my chair today, the company's entire technological brain would go dark by noon. Next, I turned my attention to the key person leverage. Our 5 largest clients, global conglomerates that accounted for nearly 70% of our annual revenue, had contracts that were explicitly tied to my personal oversight. In the general provisions section of their master service agreements, I had inserted a clause during the 2021 renewals. The client reserves the right to terminate this agreement with 48 hours notice should Joanna Harper cease to hold the position of Chief Executive Officer or lose majority voting control. I didn't need to call the clients, the system did it for me. I queued 5 automated notifications to our legal department and the client's procurement officers, ready to be released the moment my father made his announcement official to the board. The technical precision of the takeover was a marvel of corporate engineering. While my father spent his weekends at the country club and Ethan spent his in VIP lounges, I had been building a legal and digital trap. I pulled up the payroll and HR system, the heartbeat of the company. I initiated a lockdown on all executive-level administrative permissions. This meant that while Ethan might physically enter the building, he wouldn't be able to sign a single check, access a single file, or even change the password to his own company email without my direct authorization. To the system, I was the only verified authority. Everyone else was a guest. As the clock struck 8 a.m., the building began to hum with life. I watched through the glass walls of my office as the department heads arrived, their faces tight with the gossip that had undoubtedly spread over the weekend. They knew about the dinner. They knew about Ethan. Some looked at my door with pity, others with the predatory curiosity of those wondering who they should suck up to next. I remained a ghost in the machine, my fingers dancing across the keyboard as I finalized the golden handcuff, alerts for our top 20 engineers. If I were forced out, their retention bonuses, totaling nearly $3 million, would trigger immediately, payable from a restricted escrow account I had funded last year. It would bleed the company's liquid cash reserves dry in a single hour. The strategy wasn't just about winning. It was about making the company uninheritable. I had spent 12 years making Harper & Company a powerhouse, but I had spent the last 5 making it a reflection of myself. If you removed me, you didn't get a $75 million logistics firm, you got a hollowed-out shell of debt, canceled contracts, and locked servers. My father had taught me that blood was everything, but he had failed to realize that in the modern world, data and equity were the new blood. He believed in the power of the patriarch's word. I believed in the power of the executed contract. I felt a strange icy calm as I saw my father's black Mercedes pull into the executive parking lot below. Ethan followed in his neon blue Lamborghini, a car that screamed heir apparent and unearned privilege. I watched them step out, Ethan adjusting his blazer with an arrogant flick of the wrist, my father patting him on the back. They looked like conquerors. They had no idea they were walking into a fortress that had already been rewired to recognize them as intruders. I took a final sip of my now cold coffee and closed the laptop. The digital web was spun. The protocol pingamanon was live. Every server, every contract, and every dollar was now tethered to my thumbprint. I stood up, smoothed my suit, and waited. The confrontation was coming, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't the daughter waiting for approval. I was the architect waiting for the demolition to begin. The elevator pinged. The heavy double doors of the executive suite swung open. I heard Ethan's loud, obnoxious laugh echoing in the hallway, followed by my father's deep, authoritative rumble. They were coming for my chair. They were coming for my life's work. I sat back down, not behind the desk, but in the center of the room, legs crossed, a shark in a silk suit. The door to my office didn't just open. It was pushed aside with the weight of a man who thought he still owned the floor beneath my feet. "Good morning, Joanna," my father said, his voice booming with a false joviality that didn't reach his eyes. "I hope you've started packing. Ethan has a lot of ideas for this office, and we'd like to get started before the lunch rush." I didn't blink. I didn't move. I simply looked at him, and then at Ethan, who was already eyeing my desk as if it were a trophy. "Ideas are cheap, Dad," I said, my voice a whisper of sharpened steel. "But as you're about to find out, ownership is very, very expensive." The boardroom of Harper & Company had always been a place of sterile precision, a sanctuary of glass and polished obsidian, where I had spent the better part of a decade turning numbers into a $75 million reality. This morning, however, it felt like a theater of the absurd. As I walked the long corridor toward the double mahogany doors, I could feel the weight of 1,000 eyes. The office, usually a hive of kinetic energy, had slowed to a crawl. The whispers were thick, clinging to the air like humidity before a storm. I saw Sarah from accounting look away quickly, her eyes shimmering with a pity that I found more offensive than my father's betrayal. They thought they were watching a funeral procession. They thought they were seeing the fall of a queen. I pushed the doors open with a measured force, my heels striking the floor with the rhythmic cadence of a ticking clock. My father sat at the head of the table, already holding court with 3 of our most senior board members, men who had seen me grow from a college intern to the architect of their wealth. Ethan was beside him, leaning back in a $5,000 suit, his feet nearly up on the table, already exuding the unearned confidence of a man who thought the world was his birthright. The air in the room was thick with the scent of expensive cologne, and the smug satisfaction of a done deal. I didn't wait for an invitation. I took my seat directly opposite my father, the sunlight from the floor-to-ceiling windows silhouetting me in a way that I knew made my expression unreadable. "You're late for the handover, Joanna," my father said, his voice a low rumble of paternal disappointment. "We were just discussing the Q4 expansion. Ethan has some bold ideas about diversifying our asset base into crypto logistics and luxury fleet management." Ethan grinned, a flash of white teeth that lacked any depth. "It's about the future, Joe. You did great with the old school stuff, but the market is moving. We need a disruptor at the helm." I let a small, sharp smile touch my lips. "Disruption is easy, Ethan. Sustaining a $75 million valuation requires something you've never possessed, an understanding of the foundation." I turned to my father, ignoring my brother entirely. "Before we discuss the handover, I think it's important we address the technical and legal status of the company as of 9 a.m. this morning." My father sighed, a heavy theatrical sound. "Lisa, don't make this difficult. The board has already ratified the succession. Marcus has the papers. It's a clean break." "Is it?" I asked, pulling a sleek, silver tablet from my briefcase and sliding it into the center of the table. "Ethan, why don't you try to log into the Aegis Global dashboard? I assume you'll want to review the current transit manifests for the Northern Rail Corridor." Ethan scoffed and pulled his laptop toward him. "Simple enough." He typed with a flourish, his fingers stabbing at the keys. A second passed. Then 5. His brow furrowed. He tried again. "The server must be lagging. It's saying unauthorized access protocol." "Try the financial ledger," I suggested calmly. "Or perhaps the HR payroll interface." He tried both, his face reddening with every access denied that flashed across his screen. My father's expression shifted from boredom to a sharp, narrowed suspicion. "What did you do, Joanna? If you've sabotaged the servers, that's a criminal offense. I will have you escorted out in handcuffs." "I haven't sabotaged anything, Dad," I replied, my voice as cool as the glass table beneath my hands. "I've simply activated the security protocols that were baked into the Harper Logistics OS during the 2020 migration. You see, the entire software infrastructure, the predictive algorithms, the automated customs clearing codes, the proprietary fleet tracking, is not technically owned by Harper & Company. It is owned by Joanna Harper Holdings, and licensed to this firm under a continuous leadership clause. The moment the system detected a change in executive control that wasn't verified by my biometric signature, the license was suspended. Effectively, you are now running a logistics company that doesn't have a map, a compass, or a brain." The room went silent. I could hear the hum of the air conditioning, a sound that suddenly seemed deafening. The board members exchanged panicked glances. Without the Aegis system, Harper & Company was just a collection of trucks and warehouses with no way to communicate or fulfill contracts. "That's a minor hurdle," my father spat, though his hand was gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were white. "We'll have the IT team bypass it. We own the hardware." "You can try," I said, leaning forward. "But the encryption is 256-bit AES, and the keys are stored in a decentralized vault that only I can unlock. But even if you could break the code, which would take your team months, you have a much larger problem. Marcus, did you happen to read the key person riders I added to our Tier 1 client contracts during the 2021 renewal cycle?" Marcus Thorne, the family attorney, looked like he wanted to vanish into the upholstery. He fumbled with his glasses, pulling a stack of papers from his folder. I saw the riders, James. I thought they were standard retention clauses to ensure Joanna stayed on as a consultant." "Read the termination triggers, Marcus," I commanded. His voice trembled as he read. "In the event that Joanna Harper is removed from the position of CEO or loses majority voting control, the client reserves the right to terminate all master service agreements effective immediately, without penalty, citing the loss of the essential executive asset." I looked back at my father. "That's Global Retail Corp., Northern Energy, and the Euro Logistics Group. Together, they represent $52 million of our $75 million valuation. I've already sent them courtesy notifications of the leadership change. Their legal teams are likely drafting the cancellation notices as we speak. Without those contracts, and without the Aegis OS, Harper & Company isn't a $75 million empire. It's a $10 million bankruptcy waiting to happen. Ethan stood up, his chair screeching against the floor. You bitch. You're destroying the company just because you can't have it. No, Ethan, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that commanded the room. I'm protecting the company from a man who would gut it for parts. I built this. Every brick, every line of code, every relationship. You think you can walk in here and take the crown because you share my father's DNA? You don't even know how to find the server room. My father looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw something other than patronization in his eyes. I saw fear. Not fear of me, but fear of the reality that I had outplayed him so thoroughly that there was no path forward that didn't go through me. He had spent years treating me like a reliable piece of furniture, a permanent fixture that would always be there to support him. He never realized that the furniture had been redesigned into a trap. What do you want, Joanna? He asked, his voice stripped of its usual authority. I don't want your approval anymore, Dad. I've grown past the need for it, I said, standing up. The pity that had been directed at me in the hallway was now nowhere to be found. In its place was a sharp, jagged respect. I want the board to convene an emergency session. I want a formal recognition of my 60% voting majority, based on the 2017 and 2019 equity conversions. And I want Ethan's resignation on my desk by noon. I walked toward the door, stopping only to look back at my brother, who was still standing there, looking like a child who had just found out Santa Claus wasn't real. Oh, and Ethan? Don't worry about the luxury fleet idea. I've already liquidated that division's seed capital to pay for the key person insurance premiums. You were right about one thing though, disruption is the future. You just didn't realize I was the one doing the disrupting. I stepped back into the hallway. The whispers stopped instantly. The employees stood at their desks watching me as I walked past. I wasn't the daughter being replaced. I wasn't the placeholder. I was the owner. And as I reached my office door, I realized that for the first time in 12 years, I wasn't working for my father's legacy. I was working for my own. The silence that followed my declaration in the boardroom was not peaceful. It was the heavy, pressurized quiet that precedes a structural collapse. I watched the blood drain from my father's face, leaving him looking older than I had ever seen him, while Ethan remained frozen, his hand still hovering over the mahogany desk as if he could still somehow claim it by touch. The board members, men who had spent the last decade nodding at my father's anecdotes while I did the math, were now whispering frantically, a sound like dry leaves caught in a vent. They weren't worried about the family drama. They were calculating the sudden, violent evaporation of their dividends. My father, ever the performer, tried to regain his footing. He picked up the fountain pen he had brought specifically for my resignation, and tapped it against the resignation letter I had just ignored. Joanna, this is a dangerous game. You're talking about technicalities, about minor administrative shifts that Marcus can easily rectify. You are an employee of this firm. I am the founder. I hold the majority stake. Now sign the paper, and we can discuss your severance package in private. Don't embarrass yourself further. I didn't reach for the pen. Instead, I reached for the tablet again and mirrored its display onto the 80-inch 4K screen at the end of the room. The Harper & Company consolidated capitalization table appeared in stark black and white. Let's talk about the founder's stake, Dad, I said, my voice steady, cutting through the rising murmurs of the board. In 2015, during the first restructuring, you held 80%. In 2017, when you nearly bankrupted us in Brazil, you signed over 15% to me in exchange for my private $5 million bridge loan. You thought that loan was repaid in 2020. It wasn't. I tapped a key, and a subdocument titled Payment in Kind (PIK) toggle election appeared. According to the terms Marcus drafted, and you signed without reading, the repayment was optional. I elected to toggle the interest into additional equity. That 15% became 22% through compounded interest and dilution protection. Marcus Thorne made a sound like a choking bird. James, the payback clause was supposed to be a standard tax deferment strategy, he stammered, his eyes darting between the screen and my father's reddening face. It was, I agreed smoothly. If you had actually paid the principal. But you didn't. You used the cash reserves to fund Ethan's concierge venture. Assuming I'd just let the debt slide. I didn't. Then there's the 2019 performance warrants. I highlighted a section in glowing amber. I hit every KPI. The board ratified those targets in a public filing. When the company valuation hit $50 million last quarter, those warrants exercised automatically. That brought me to 48%. That's still not a majority, Ethan spat, finally finding his voice. He stood up, trying to loom over me, but he just looked like a frantic child in an expensive suit. Dad still has the rest. You're just a minority shareholder with a loud mouth. I looked at Arthur Vance, the oldest member of the board and a man who had been my father's golf partner for 30 years. Arthur, let's talk about that unpaid internal debt you've been carrying on the books for your regional transport subsidiary. $4 million in outstanding receivables owed to Harper & Company for the last 3 years. Arthur stiffened. That was an informal arrangement, Joanna. Your father approved the extension. My father approved a breach of fiduciary duty, I countered. 6 months ago, I purchased that debt through a holding company, J Alpha Ventures. I didn't ask for the cash, Arthur. I offered to swap that debt for your 12% stake in the parent company. You signed the transfer in October because you were terrified I'd call the loan and liquidate your subsidiary. You didn't tell James because you didn't want him to know how badly you'd mismanaged your books. The room went deathly silent. Arthur lowered his head, unable to meet my father's gaze. 48% plus Arthur's 12%, I said, the numbers appearing on the screen with a final digital thud. 60%. Majority voting control. I am the majority shareholder, the lead creditor, and the sole owner of the proprietary OS that runs every truck in this fleet. I turned to the rest of the board. Gentlemen, you have a choice. You can follow James and Ethan into a protracted legal battle that I will fund with the very dividends you are currently losing. Or, you can acknowledge the reality of the cap table and help me stabilize this company before Global Retail Corp cancels their $20 million contract at noon. The panic in the room shifted. It was no longer a frantic whisper. It was a cold, calculating pivot. I saw the board members looking at my father, not as a leader but as a liability. Sloan, the head of the audit committee, was the first to speak. James, if what she's saying about the PIK notes and the debt swap is true, your position is legally untenable. We can't ratify Ethan's appointment if the majority shareholder opposes it. It would be a direct violation of our bylaws. I am the majority, my father roared, slamming his fist onto the table. This is my name on the building. It's a brand, Dad, I said, standing up. And right now, that brand is associated with 20% growth under me and a potential bankruptcy under Ethan. The board knows that. The markets know that. I walked over to Ethan, who was still standing by my chair. I didn't touch him, I didn't need to. The sheer weight of my presence forced him to step back. I reclaimed my seat at the head of the table. Ethan, your resignation from the board is effective immediately. Marcus, you will prepare the paperwork for a buyout of Ethan's 5% stake at the pre-2021 valuation. Take it, Ethan, it's more than you'll ever make on your own. I looked at my father. As for you, Dad, you can remain as founder emeritus. You'll keep your office, you'll keep your title for the press, but you will have zero voting rights and zero input on operations. That is the only way I don't file a formal suit against you for the $4 million in misallocated funds used to prop up Arthur's subsidiary. My father looked at the board members, searching for a single hand raised in his defense. Not one moved. They were looking at me, waiting for their next instructions. He had spent a lifetime building loyalty through golf games and old boy handshakes. I had spent 12 years building loyalty through profit margins and ironclad contracts. In the end, the math was more loyal than the man. You've been planning this for years, my father whispered, the fire in his eyes finally extinguished. Every late night, every report, you were just waiting to kill me. No, Dad, I said, leaning forward, my voice quiet enough that only he could hear the heartbreak beneath the steel. I was waiting for you to see me. I gave you 12 years to realize that I was the only one who could save this company. You had 1,000 chances to make me your partner. You chose to make me a placeholder instead. I didn't kill your legacy. I just took it away from the person who was going to destroy it. I looked at the clock. 10:15 a.m. Sloan, call the legal teams at Global Retail and Northern Energy. Tell them the leadership transition has been clarified. Aegis OS will be back online in 5 minutes. Meeting adjourned. I didn't watch them leave. I didn't need to see my father's slumped shoulders or Ethan's silent, boiling rage as they walked out of the room they thought they had conquered. I stayed in my chair, staring at the screen where my name sat next to the number 60. I had won the company, but as the door clicked shut, the silence in the room felt less like a victory and more like a fortress. I had secured the empire. Now I had to ensure that no one, not my family, not the board, and certainly not the ghosts of my own sacrifices, could ever find a way back in. The boardroom door hadn't been closed for 5 minutes before the internal servers began to scream. On my monitor, the Aegis Global dashboard flickered from a dormant, warning red back into a pulsating rhythmic green. Data packets, millions of them, resumed their journey across continents, tracking shipping containers in the mid-Atlantic and freight trains crossing the Rockies. The protocol pingamanon had been deactivated, but the echoes of the lockdown still vibrated through the building. Outside my glass walls, the change of control chaos was palpable. I could see the heads of the IT department huddled in the hallway, their faces a mixture of terror and awe. They had spent 3 hours trying to crack a vault that didn't just have a lock, but a self-destruct sequence. I sat behind my desk, the weight of the $75 million empire finally resting on my shoulders without the buffering presence of my father's name. But the victory was fragile. In the corporate world, a majority stake is a fortress, but a legal challenge is a siege. The door to my office swung open with a violence that suggested the hinges might give way. It wasn't Ethan this time. He had likely slunk off to find a lawyer or a drink, whichever was closer. It was James Harper. He didn't look like the polished patriarch from the dinner party. His tie was loosened, his eyes were bloodshot, and he was clutching a mobile phone as if it were a weapon. "I just got off the phone with the firm of Miller & Associates," he barked, his voice vibrating with a dangerous, cornered energy. "We are filing for an emergency injunction. I'm claiming corporate theft, elder abuse, and a fraudulent transfer of equity. I will have a judge freeze every single one of your J-Alpha accounts by sunset. I'll tie you up in discovery for the next decade, Joanna. You think you've won? You've just started a war that will bankrupt you before you can even spend a dime of my money." I didn't stand up. I didn't even stop the rhythmic tapping of my pen against the desk. Bankruptcy is an interesting choice of words, Dad. But you're looking at the wrong ledger. "Don't patronize me," he roared, slamming his palms onto the desk. "I built this name. I will burn this building to the ground before I let a treacherous daughter steal it from under me." "Sit down, James," I said, dropping the dad entirely. The coldness in my voice seemed to hit him like a physical barrier. He hesitated, then sank into the guest chair, his chest heaving. "You're talking about a legal battle," I continued, leaning forward into the pool of light cast by my desk lamp. "A battle that will take years. But Harper & Company doesn't have years. It has exactly 18 hours. That's how long it takes for the morning news cycle to reach the procurement offices of our top 5 clients." I pulled up a document on my primary screen, the Master Service Agreement for Global Retail Corp., our single largest partner. I scrolled down to section 14.4, Executive Stability and Key Person Provision. "While you were busy playing the role of the visionary founder at industry galas, I was the one negotiating the fine print," I said. "Our top 5 clients, the ones who provide 70% of our annual revenue, didn't sign with Harper & Company because of the Harper name. They signed because of the Aegis infrastructure and the person who manages it. Me." I highlighted the clause in a piercing neon blue. I inserted a key person rider into every one of those contracts during the 2021 renewals. It's a standard protective measure in high-stakes logistics, but I made mine specific. The clause states that the contract is contingent upon my active, daily oversight as CEO or majority shareholder. If there is a material change in executive control that excludes me, the client has the right to terminate the agreement for convenience, immediately, with 0 exit fees. James stared at the screen, his mouth tightening into a thin line. "They wouldn't do it. They need us. They need a logistics partner that is stable, I countered. The moment your emergency injunction hits the wires, the moment the news breaks that the founder is suing his own CEO and freezing the company's assets, those clients will trigger these clauses. Not because they hate you, but because their shareholders won't allow them to stay on a sinking ship. Global Retail Corp alone is $20 million of our valuation. Northern Energy is another $15 million. By the time your lawyer even gets a court date, those 5 contracts will be gone. I paused, letting the silence do the heavy lifting. And here is the math you haven't considered. Without those contracts, our valuation doesn't just drop. It evaporates. We have $15 million in outstanding equipment leases and $8 million in revolving credit lines that are all marked to market. The moment those contracts are voided, the banks will call the loans. The company's value won't be $75 million, or even $10 million. It will be zero. In fact, we'll be in the red. You won't be fighting for an empire, James. You'll be fighting for the right to be the chairman of a pile of debt and a few thousand empty shipping crates. My father looked at the monitor, then back at me. The bravado was leaking out of him, replaced by the grim realization that I had built a poison pill into the very fabric of the company's revenue stream. I had made myself the only oxygen in the room. If they forced me out, they would all suffocate. You'd let it all burn, he whispered, his voice cracking. Everything you worked for? You'd destroy it just to spite me. I'm not the one holding the match, James. You are, I said. I'm the one offering to keep the fire contained. You can file your injunction. You can spend the next 10 years in a courtroom trying to prove I tricked you into signing those piquet notes. But by tomorrow morning, there will be no Harper & Company left to fight over. Ethan will have nothing. You will have nothing but legal fees and a legacy of failure. Is that the Harper bloodline victory you wanted? The intercom buzzed. It was my executive assistant, her voice sounding strained. Joanna, the chief procurement officer from Global Retail Corp, is on line 1. He's seen the change of command memo Ethan sent out earlier, and is asking for a formal verification of the key person status. I looked at my father, the phone line blinking like a countdown timer between us. That's the first domino, James. Do I tell him the contract is safe because I'm in control? Or do I tell him to start looking for a new provider because you're suing me? For a long minute, the only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall. James Harper, the man who had dominated my life for 30 years, looked down at his hands. He looked at the fountain pen he was still clutching, the one he'd intended for my professional execution. Slowly, he placed it on my desk. Tell them there was a misunderstanding, he muttered, his voice barely audible. Tell them the transition was a strategy session, not a replacement. You're in control, Joanna. And the injunction? I asked, my finger hovering over the phone button. There will be no injunction, he said, standing up with a heavy, defeated grace. He didn't look at me as he walked toward the door. He looked like a man who had realized he was a guest in a house he thought he owned. I picked up the phone. Marcus, put him through, I said, my voice smooth and professional. And get the board on a conference bridge. We have a lot of work to do to repair the damage Ethan caused this morning. As the call connected, I watched my father disappear into the hallway. The change of control chaos was far from over, and the fallout from the dinner would haunt our family for years. But as the first major client's voice filled the room, I felt the $75 million empire solidify beneath me. I hadn't just taken the company, I had made it impossible for them to take it back. The queen was on her throne, and the board was finally forced to realize that the crown didn't belong to the Harper name. It belonged to the Harper who knew how to keep the lights on. The headlines hit the digital newsstands before my first cup of coffee had even cooled. Corporate coup, the Harper family civil war, blared the Business Insider banner, followed quickly by a more salacious piece in the Global Gazette titled, "The Daughter Who Stole the Empire." My father had wasted no time. Forced into a corner legally, he had pivoted to the only arena where he still felt he held the advantage, the court of public opinion. He was a master of the old guard narrative, a man who understood that if you couldn't win on the facts, you won on the feelings. By 9 a.m., a video clip was circulating of my father standing on the steps of his estate, looking uncharacteristically frail, flanked by a somber-looking Ethan. "It's a tragedy," James Harper told the gaggle of reporters. his voice hushed and heavy with performative grief. Joanna has always been driven, but this is a clinical obsession. She's not well. She's manipulated legal loopholes to lock out her own flesh and blood. As a father, my heart breaks for her. But as the founder of this company, I must warn our shareholders that the firm is currently in the hands of someone who is emotionally and mentally volatile. It was a classic hysteria play, the oldest weapon in the patriarchal handbook. If a woman is ambitious, she's obsessed. If she's strategic, she's calculating. If she wins, she must be unstable. Across the city, Ethan was busy playing the role of the dutiful, wounded successor. He was sighted at a high-end bistro with an unnamed source from a major business daily, reportedly sharing concerns about my recent breakdown and how I had been hallucinating executive authority for months. They weren't just attacking my leadership. They were trying to dismantle my personhood to trigger a mental incapacity clause in the board's bylaws. I sat in my office, watching the volatility index of our private valuation tick downward. The board was panicking. My phone was a chorus of frantic pings from investors who were suddenly terrified that they had backed a madwoman. My executive assistant, Claire, hovered by the door, her face a mask of anxiety. The PR firm is on line 3, Joanna. They want to draft a counterstatement. They're suggesting we go on the evening news to show you're, well, calm. No counterstatement, Claire, I said, not lifting my eyes from the spread of spreadsheets on my monitor. A statement is defensive. It admits there is a debate. We aren't going to argue about my sanity. We are going to change the subject to the only thing that actually matters in this building, the math. I didn't call a press conference. I didn't cry on camera. Instead, I initiated an involuntary disclosure of operational metrics through an anonymous, encrypted portal favored by whistleblowers and high-frequency traders. I didn't leak a diary. I leaked an audited 10-year longitudinal study of capital allocation at Harper & Company, titled The Harper Efficiency Audit, 2014 to 2026. The document was a surgical masterpiece of data visualization. It stripped away the names and the family drama, replacing them with two distinct lines of inquiry: Executive Asset A, me, and Executive Asset B, Ethan. I had prepared this report months ago as a contingency, knowing that the family card was the only card my father had left to play. The audit was brutal. It showed that under my direct oversight, the logistics division had achieved a 300% increase in EBITDA margin. It highlighted the $22 million in ghost losses from 2017 to 2021, capital that had been siphoned into Ethan's Special Projects division. I included the forensic breakdown of the Ethan Ventures, the $4 million blockchain concierge service that had 0 active users but $1.5 million in travel and entertainment expenses, the $6 million luxury fleet initiative that had resulted in 3 leased Lamborghinis and 0 contracts, and the $5 million consultancy fees paid to his offshore shell companies. Below Ethan's dismal metrics, I placed my own: the 98% client retention rate, the $15 million in savings from the Aegis OS implementation, and the fact that I had personally funded the company's payroll during the Brazil crisis with my own dividends that Ethan had spent on a Mediterranean yacht charter. I didn't have to say a word. By noon, the narrative had shifted with the violent speed of a market crash. The Financial Times picked up the report. Their headline read, "The Cost of Nepotism. Leaked Audit Reveals $20 million Drain by Harper Air." Suddenly, the disloyal daughter was being reframed as the prudent steward, who had been quietly protecting shareholder value from a parasitic family member. The unstable label didn't stick when contrasted with a document that showed a woman who had managed complex global logistics with the precision of a Swiss watch. By 2 p.m., the unnamed sources who had been whispering to Ethan suddenly vanished. The board members who had been considering an incapacity hearing were now calling me to apologize, their voices dripping with a new, terrified respect. They realized that if they moved against me, I wouldn't just take the servers. I would release the full forensic audit of their own expense accounts and informal arrangements with my father. I was finishing a call with the head of the Northern Energy Group, who had just reaffirmed their contract after seeing the audit, when my father called my private line. I let it ring 4 times. "You've destroyed him, Joanna," he whispered, his voice stripped of the theatrical vibrance it had held this morning. "Ethan is a laughingstock. No firm in this city will ever hire him. You've aired our dirty laundry in the town square. I didn't air our laundry, James, I said, leaning back and watching the sunset begin to paint the city in shades of gold and iron. I simply showed the market what it was actually paying for. You told the press I was obsessed. I just proved I was effective. There's a difference. He's your brother, he said, the old, tired plea for loyalty. And I was your daughter, I countered. But that didn't stop you from trying to erase 12 years of my life at a dinner table. Loyalty is a two-way street, James. You and Ethan treated this company like a personal ATM. I treated it like a legacy. The market has decided which of us it prefers. I hung up before he could respond. I didn't feel a surge of triumph, only a cold sense of equilibrium. The PR war was won, not through charm or sentiment, but through the undeniable weight of performance. I had used the very thing they devalued, my work, to render their only weapon, their name, obsolete. As I walked out of the office that evening, the staff didn't look at me with pity. They didn't even look at me with curiosity. They looked at me with the silent, focused attention of people who knew exactly who was in charge of their paychecks. I had crossed the Rubicon. I was no longer the daughter of James Harper. I was the CEO of a $75 million empire that had just proven it didn't need a patriarch to survive. I had turned their family card into a bankruptcy notice, and as I stepped into the elevator, I knew that the next time my father spoke of legacy, he would be doing so from the sidelines of a game I had already won. The morning after the audit leak, the office was eerily quiet, the kind of stillness that exists in the eye of a hurricane. While the public narrative had shifted in my favor, a gnawing question remained. Why? Why would a man as obsessed with his own legacy as James Harper risk the stability of a $75 million empire to install a proven failure like Ethan? My father was many things, arrogant, patriarchal, and stubborn, but he wasn't traditionally stupid when it came to his own survival. There was a missing variable in the equation, a hidden pressure point that forced his hand. I didn't turn to the board or the company's internal security for this. I called Elias Thorne, no relation to Marcus, a man who operated in the gray market of corporate intelligence. I had put Elias on retainer the moment I saw Ethan's name on the dinner invitation 3 weeks ago. By 10 a.m. Elias was sitting in my office, sliding a thick, unmarked manila envelope across the obsidian desk. You were looking for a motive, Joanna, Elias said, his voice a dry rasp. Turns out, your brother didn't just spend his time in Macau and Monaco networking. He spent it losing. I opened the envelope. The first thing that hit me wasn't a spreadsheet, but a series of photographs. Ethan at a high-stakes baccarat table in a private suite. Ethan looking disheveled, arguing with men whose silhouettes screamed, unregulated debt collection. But it was the financial ledger at the back that turned my blood to ice. Ethan hadn't just lost his inheritance. He had lost money he didn't have, totaling nearly $12 million. He owes this to the Vanguard Group, Elias explained, leaning back. Specifically, the private credit arm controlled by Silas Vane. My breath hitched. Silas Vane wasn't just a creditor. He was the CEO of Vane Logistics, our most aggressive and ruthless competitor. For years, Vane had been trying to hostilely take over our Northern Rail contracts. Now he didn't need a corporate raid. He owned the heir to the Harper throne. The twist was more devious than a simple gambling addiction. The document showed a series of memorandums of understanding, signed by Ethan in a drug-fueled haze in a penthouse in Singapore. In exchange for the cancellation of his $12 million debt, Ethan had agreed that, upon his appointment as CEO of Harper & Company, he would approve a strategic merger with Vane Logistics, at a valuation that would essentially gift our assets to Silas Vane for pennies on the dollar. My father knew. I saw the evidence in a frantic string of encrypted emails between James and Ethan. My father wasn't installing Ethan out of love or tradition. He was doing it out of a desperate, panicked attempt to cover up a felony. If the debt went public, Ethan would face prison for interstate fraud, and the Harper name would be dragged through the mud of a racketeering scandal. James thought that by making Ethan CEO, he could use the company's treasury to quietly buy out the debt under the guise of an acquisition, burying the evidence in the merger's fine print. He was willing to sacrifice the company I built to save a son who had betrayed it. There's more, Elias added, tapping a document titled Unauthorized Asset Pledges. To get an advance on his credit line last month, Ethan forged your signature on a collateral agreement. He pledged the Aegis OS source code as security for his personal markers. That was the power move. Forgery, corporate espionage, embezzlement. It was no longer a family dispute, it was a criminal enterprise. I felt a cold, crystalline fury settle over me. 12 years of my life had been treated as a bargaining chip for a gambler's debt. I didn't call my father. I didn't call the police. Not yet. I waited until the market closed, and then I summoned both James and Ethan to my office. When they walked in, Ethan still had a trace of his old arrogance, though it was frayed at the edges. My father looked like a man walking toward a scaffold. I didn't say a word. I simply spread the photographs and the Vane Logistics merger memo across the desk like a hand of winning cards. Ethan's face went from pale to a sickly, translucent gray. He collapsed into a chair, his breath coming in shallow hitches. My father stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the forged signature on the collateral agreement. $12 million, Ethan? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. You were going to hand Silas Vane the keys to the Aegis servers? You were going to sell out 500 employees and 12 years of my work to pay off a baccarat debt. I was going to fix it, Ethan stammered, his voice cracking. Dad said we could mask the payment as a consultancy fee. Once the merger went through, nobody would have known. I would have known, I said, standing up and walking around the desk. I stood over him, the silence of the room amplifying the sound of his panic. And now the FBI would love to know. Forgery of a corporate officer's signature on a security pledge is a federal offense, Ethan. Not to mention the RICO implications of colluding with a competitor to devalue a $75 million firm. My father stepped forward, his hands trembling. Joanna, please. We can settle this. I'll sell my remaining shares to pay the debt. We don't have to involve the authorities. He's your brother. He stopped being my brother when he put a price tag on my life's work, I said, turning to my father. You knew about the forgery, James. You tried to force me out to protect a criminal. That makes you an accessory after the fact. I pulled out a single sheet of paper, a formal irrevocable confession and a full surrender of all remaining equity and claims to the Harper estate, including Ethan's 5% and my father's 35%. Here is the deal, I said, the steel in my voice leaving no room for negotiation. Ethan, you sign this confession. You leave the country tonight. You will live on a stipend I provide, in a location I choose, and if you ever set foot on a casino floor or contact a Vane Logistics employee again, I hand this folder to the district attorney. James, you sign over every single one of your voting and non-voting shares to me for the sum of $1. You retire tonight. No founder emeritus title. No office. No legacy. You're stripping us of everything, my father whispered. I'm keeping you out of a federal penitentiary, I corrected, which is more than either of you deserves. You have 10 minutes to sign. After that, Elias sends the digital copies to the SEC and the FBI. The silence that followed was absolute. I watched as the two men who had tried to erase me realized that they were now entirely at my mercy. One by one they picked up the pen. The scratching of the ink against the paper was the only sound in the room, the sound of the old Harper dynasty finally, legally, and permanently collapsing. As they finished, I gathered the papers. I didn't feel joy. I felt the immense, heavy burden of the truth. I had the power to put them in prison, but I had chosen to put them in a cage of my own making instead. I was no longer just the CEO. I was the warden. Get out, I said, not looking up from the documents. The car is waiting downstairs to take you to the airport, Ethan. James, your things will be sent to the estate tomorrow. You are barred from this building effective immediately. As the door closed behind them, I sat back down in my chair. The $75 million empire was now mine, 100% of it. But as I looked at the empty room, I realized the cost of the crown. I had saved the company, but I had finally irrevocably lost the family. I picked up the phone. Claire? Call the head of security. Change the biometric locks on the executive floor. And call Silas Vane. Tell him I'm looking forward to our merger discussion. But he'll be the one selling, not me. The war wasn't over. But for the first time in 12 years, I was the only one holding the map. The victory in the boardroom felt like a victory on paper, but the air in my penthouse that evening was heavy with a different kind of silence. The legal documents were signed, the equity was transferred, and the security protocols had successfully shielded the company from a total collapse. But the architecture of a family is harder to dismantle than a logistics empire. At 8 p.m. the intercom buzzed. It wasn't the police and it wasn't a process server. It was my mother, Eleanor Harper. When she walked into the room, she didn't look like the matriarch who had spent decades hosting charity galas and smoothing over my father's rough edges. She looked small, wrapped in a beige cashmere coat that seemed to swallow her. She didn't look at the sweeping view of the city I had conquered. She looked at me with an expression of profound, weary disappointment. "Joanna," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "What have you done?" "I saved the company, Mom," I said, pouring a glass of water I didn't want just to have something to do with my hands. "And I saved your son from a 20-year prison sentence. I thought you'd be relieved." "Relieved?" She stepped further into the room, her eyes glassing over. "You've exiled your brother. You've stripped your father of his dignity, his life's work. You've turned our name into a headline for a corporate scandal. People are talking, Joanna. The club, the neighbors. They think you're a monster." I felt a sharp, bitter laugh rise in my throat. The neighbors? Mom, Ethan forged my signature. He was going to sell our assets to Silas Vane to pay off a gambling debt. Dad tried to help him hide it by firing me. Where was your concern for dignity when they were plotting to throw me under the bus? She sat on the edge of my velvet sofa, looking like a stranger in my home. "He's a boy, Joanna. He made mistakes. He's always struggled to find his way in your shadow. Your father just wanted him to have a chance. To have something of his own." I set the glass down with a sharp clack on the marble counter. A chance? He had 100 chances. He had millions of dollars in vanity startups that I funded with my sweat. He had the best education, the best connections. He didn't struggle in my shadow. He basked in the luxury my work provided while he gambled away our future. And you knew, didn't you? The silence that followed was the answer. My mother looked at her manicured hands, avoiding my gaze. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, colder and more surgical than any of my father's betrayals. "You knew about the Macau debts," I whispered, stepping closer to her. "You knew he was using company funds as his personal piggy bank. That's why you stayed quiet at dinner, isn't it? You weren't surprised by Dad's announcement. You were the one who pushed him to do it. You thought that if Ethan were CEO, the scandal could stay in the family. We were protecting the family, Joanna," she snapped, finally looking up, her face flushed with a desperate, misplaced loyalty. "If the truth came out, we would lose everything. Our social standing, our legacy. I thought if you just stepped aside for a year or two, let him settle the debts under the guise of the merger, then you could come back. You're strong. You're the reliable one. You can handle a few years of consulting. Ethan would have been destroyed. So you decided to destroy me instead," I said, my voice dropping to a level of terrifying calm. "The reliable one. The one who doesn't need protection. The one who is expected to sacrifice her life's work so the boy can keep playing at being a man." The image of that dinner table replayed in my mind, the clinking of the glasses, my father's hand on Ethan's shoulder, and my mother's unreadable expression across the table. It wasn't unreadable. It was complicit. She had sat there, eating her dinner, knowing that they were committing a grand larceny against my soul. "I'm asking you to tear up those papers, Joanna," she said, her voice dropping into a pleading, manipulative softness. "Give your father back his shares. Let Ethan come home. We can handle the Vane situation quietly. We'll find the money. Just step down. For the sake of the family." I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the bars of the cage I had been living in for 30 years. To them, family wasn't a bond of mutual respect or love. It was a hierarchy where I was the engine and they were the passengers, and the moment the engine asked to steer, it was considered unstable. "No," I said. She blinked, stunned. "No? Joanna, I'm your mother." "And I was your daughter," I replied, the emotional ties finally snapping with a crystalline sound in my mind. "But you stopped seeing me as a person a long time ago. I was just a placeholder." A tool to keep the Harper name polished while the men tarnished it. You didn't come here to see if I was okay after being betrayed. You came here to see if the tool could be put back in its box. I walked over to the door and held it open. The city lights behind me felt like the only honest things left in the world. The family you're trying to save doesn't exist anymore, Mom, I said. It died the moment Father called Ethan's name at that dinner table. It died when he looked at me and said placeholder while you watched. You chose your side that night. You chose the gambler over the builder. You chose the lie over the truth. You'll be alone, Joanna, she said, standing up, her voice turning cold and venomous. You'll have your $75 million, but you'll have no one to share it with. Is that what you want? I've been alone for 12 years, Mom, I said, a sad smile touching my lips. I was alone in those shipyards. I was alone in those boardrooms. The only difference is now I'm alone on my own terms. I'd rather be lonely in my own empire than be a servant in your crumbling house. She walked past me without another word, the scent of her expensive perfume lingering in the air like a ghost. I closed the door and locked it. It was the first time I had ever locked my mother out of my life, and yet I felt lighter than I had in a decade. The verdict was final. The Harper name was no longer a family. It was a brand I owned 100%. I walked back to my desk and picked up the phone. It was time to finalize the board appointments for Chapter 10. The purge was coming, and I wouldn't be doing it for family. I'd be doing it for the only thing that had never lied to me, the business. The air in the Harper & Company executive boardroom was cold, filtered through an HVAC system I had personally upgraded to be 30% more efficient. I sat at the head of the table, not leaning back like my father used to, but perched forward, my hands flat on the polished obsidian surface. Across from me sat the old guard, 7 men who had collectively spent over a century coasting on my father's charisma, while I did the heavy lifting. They looked like statues from a bygone era. Arthur Vance, the debt dodger, Sloan, the silent auditor, and 5 others who had spent the last week trying to figure out which way the wind was blowing. Today the wind wasn't blowing. It was a gale. This emergency session of the board is now in order, I said, my voice cutting through the nervous shuffling of papers. I didn't offer them coffee. I didn't offer them small talk. The agenda is simple. The total restructuring of Harper & Company's governance. Based on the 60% voting majority I now hold through J Alpha Ventures, I am exercising my right under Article 4, Section 2 of our bylaws to dissolve the current board of directors, effective immediately. A collective gasp went around the room. Arthur Vance stood up, his face purple. You can't do that, Joanna. We have staggered terms. You need a supermajority for a total dissolution. I have a supermajority, Arthur, I said, sliding a tablet toward him. I didn't just buy your debt. Over the last 48 hours, I've executed the drag-along rights on the minority shares held by the pension fund. Shares I've managed for years. I now represent 78% of the voting power. Your staggered terms were rendered moot the moment the material breach of fiduciary duty clause was triggered by your failure to report Ethan's forgery. I looked at each of them. You all knew. You saw the consultancy fees. You saw the siphoning of capital. You stayed quiet because James promised you a piece of the Vane merger. That makes you liabilities, not leaders. I didn't wait for their rebuttals. I tapped a command on my screen, and the double doors opened. 6 people walked in. They were young, diverse, and lacked the country club pedigree my father adored. Among them was Marcus Chun, a 30-year-old logistics prodigy I'd poached from a tech giant. Elena Rossi, a forensic accountant who had spent her career dismantling shell companies. And Leo Vance, no relation to Arthur, an AI specialist. Meet the new provisional board, I said, as the old men were forced to stand and make room. They don't have golf handicaps, but they do have the technical capacity to run a $100 million firm. Your severance packages, minimums only per the for cause termination clauses, are waiting with HR. Security will escort you to collect your personal items. Your company devices have already been wiped. It was a bloodless massacre. The old guard shuffled out, looking suddenly small and obsolete. As the door closed behind the last of them, I turned to the new team. We have 12 hours to stabilize the Northern Rail contracts and 24 to patch the Aegis OS vulnerabilities Ethan created. Let's get to work. But there was one final piece of business. I walked out of the boardroom and into the smaller, private annex where Ethan was being held under the watchful eye of Elias Thorne. Ethan looked ravaged. His $5,000 suit was wrinkled, and the arrogance that had defined him was replaced by a twitchy, feral desperation. He looked at me, and for the first time he didn't see a sister. He saw a predator. "Is the car ready?" he croaked. "The car is ready, Ethan," I said, tossing a manila envelope onto the table. "Inside is a one-way ticket to a remote estate I've purchased in rural Argentina. There is a trust fund that will pay you a modest monthly stipend. Enough for a comfortable, quiet life, but not enough for a single hand of high-stakes poker." I leaned over the table, my shadow falling over him. "But there are conditions. You sign a full, irrevocable waiver of the Harper name. You are no longer Ethan Harper. You are a ghost. You will never contact a business associate, a journalist, or a family member again. If you so much as open a LinkedIn account, the forgery charges I've filed with the DA will be unstayed, and you will spend the next 20 years in a federal cell." Ethan looked at the ticket, then at the confession. "Argentina? You're exiling me to a farm." "I'm giving you a life," I said. "Which is more than Silas Vane would have given you once he realized the Aegis codes were locked. You have 30 seconds to decide. The farm or the cage." Ethan's hand shook as he grabbed the pen. He signed so hard the paper nearly tore. He didn't look at me as Elias led him toward the service elevator. He was gone, a footnote in the history of a company he almost destroyed. I walked back to my office and stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass. The sun was setting, casting long golden shadows across the city. The purge was complete. My father was neutralized, the board was modernized, and the poison of my brother's presence was purged from our system. For the first time in 12 years, the air in this building felt clean. I was the majority owner. I was the CEO. I was the only Harper left standing. I picked up my phone and dialed Marcus Chen. "Marcus? Start the audit on the Vane Logistics acquisition. I don't just want to defend our territory anymore. I want to take theirs." The office felt cavernous now that the frantic energy of the day had settled. The new board was already sequestered in the war room on the floor below, but here on the top floor of the Harper building, the silence was absolute. I stood by the window watching the city lights blink on like a million small promises. The $75 million valuation was already a memory. With the new algorithms and the Northern Rail contracts secured, we were looking at $100 million by the next fiscal quarter. A soft click of the door broke the silence. I didn't turn around. I knew the weight of that step anywhere. James Harper didn't walk in with his usual booming authority. He moved like a man who had realized too late that the floor beneath him was made of glass. He stood in the center of the room, looking at the empty desk, the desk he had tried to give to a gambler, and then at me. "The car for Ethan just left for the airport," he said, his voice thin, stripped of its resonant timbre. He didn't even say goodbye to his mother. "He didn't have much to say, James," I replied, finally turning to face him. I kept the desk between us, a psychological barrier that felt more like a fortress. He chose the buyout. He chose the farm. It's more than he gave this company. My father sat in the guest chair, the same chair where I had sat for 12 years, listening to him explain why I wasn't ready for the title I was already earning. He looked around the office, his eyes landing on the updated organizational chart on my monitor. "You've erased them all," he whispered. "Arthur Sloan, the entire board. Men I've known for 30 years. Gone in a single afternoon. They weren't leaders, James. They were spectators," I said, leaning against the window ledge. "They watched you nearly sink the ship in 2017, and they watched Ethan try to sell the lifeboats last week. I don't pay people to watch. I pay them to build." He looked at me, then really looked at me, and for the first time there was no patronizing warmth, no daughterly affection. There was only a cold, bewildered fear. "When did you become this cold, Joanna? When did my little girl turn into a corporate executioner?" I felt a sharp crystalline pang in my chest, but I didn't let it reach my face. "I didn't turn into this, James. You forged me into this. You became the hammer, and I became the steel." I walked slowly toward the desk, my heels echoing in the hollow room. "I became this cold the moment you taught me that my work was worthless just because I was your daughter. I became this when I realized that 12 years of 100-hour weeks, saved bankruptcies, and record-breaking profits wouldn't even buy me the decency of a private conversation before you tried to replace me at a dinner party. I was trying to preserve the name, he shouted, his old fire flickering for a brief second. A son. A son carries the name forward. I thought you'd understand. I thought you'd be happy to be the power behind the throne. The throne was mine by right of conquest, not birthright, I countered, my voice dropping to a level that made him flinch. You wanted a puppet. You wanted a ghost to run the machine while your son took the credit. But ghosts don't sign contracts, James. And puppets don't own the servers. I slid a final document across the desk. It was a formal retirement agreement. It stripped him of his founder emeritus title, his expense account, and his access to the building. It converted his remaining 35% stake into non-voting Class B shares. He would be wealthy, extraordinarily so, but he would be silent. You're forcing me into a gilded cage, he said, looking at the signature line. I'm giving you a graceful exit, I corrected. Sign it, and the press release tomorrow says you're retiring to focus on philanthropy and family. Don't sign it, and I release the forensic audit of your personal expenses. I'll let the board, my board, sue you for every cent you siphon to pay for Ethan's Mediterranean excursions. You'll be James Harper, the man who robbed his own company. He picked up the pen. His hand shook just a fraction. It was the same pen he had used to sign the 2017 debt notes he never intended to pay. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. You've won, he muttered, the ink drying on the page. You have the building. You have the money. You have the power. But look at this room, Joanna. It's empty. You're the queen of nothing. No, James, I said, taking the document and filing it into my briefcase. I'm the CEO of a $100 million empire. And for the first time in my life, I don't have to look over my shoulder to see if my own father is holding a knife. I walked him to the door. I didn't offer a hug. I didn't offer a thank you. As he stepped into the hallway, he paused, looking back at the logo on the wall, Harper & Company. Will you change the name? He asked, his voice barely a breath. I looked at the silver letters, then back at the man who had given me the name but denied me the respect. The name stays. But from now on, when people hear Harper, they won't think of you. They'll think of me. I closed the door. The showdown was over. There were no more masks to peel away. There was only the truth and the work that remained. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop. I had an empire to run. The transformation of Harper & Company was no longer a headline. It was a case study in corporate evolution. 1 year had passed since the night the servers went dark and the masks came off. Under my solo leadership, the firm hadn't just stabilized, it had transcended. We didn't just move freight. We managed the global flow of information. The valuation had surged past the $100 million mark, driven by a 40% increase in operational efficiency and the successful acquisition of Vane Logistics' primary rail assets. Silas Vane had tried to play me as a pawn. I ended up buying his knight and his rook. The executive purge had birthed a culture of meritocracy that my father wouldn't recognize. The hallways of the headquarters were no longer filled with the hushed, fearful whispers of a family dynasty in decay. Instead, they hummed with the electric energy of a tech-forward powerhouse. Marcus Chen and Elena Rossi had rebuilt the company's heart, and for the first time in 12 years, I wasn't the only one staying late because I had to. I stayed because I chose to. On the anniversary of that fateful dinner, I found myself standing in front of the same mahogany doors of the restaurant where it had all begun. The air was cool, the city lights reflecting in the polished brass handles. I wasn't wearing the charcoal armor of a woman going to war. I wore a simple, elegant silk dress, a shade of deep emerald that felt like life, not ash. I walked inside and the maitre d' recognized me instantly. He didn't offer the pitying smile he had given me a year ago. He offered a deep, respectful nod. This way, Miss Harper. Your table is ready. I sat in the exact same chair where I had watched my father toast to my brother's unearned future. The table was set for one. I ordered a bottle of the same vintage Cabernet my father had used to wash down his betrayal, but this time the scent didn't remind me of an antiseptic. It smelled like the earth, rich, grounded, and enduring. As I waited for my meal, I reflected on the cost of the crown. I hadn't heard from Ethan since he reached Argentina. His monthly stipend was a silent tether, a reminder that he was alive but erased. My mother sent sporadic, formal emails, invitations to charity events I never attended, requests for family meetings that were really just veiled attempts to regain a foothold in the company. My father lived in a villa in the south of France, wealthy and invisible, a king without a country. I had lost a family, but I had gained a self. For 12 years I had been a ghost haunting my own life, a placeholder waiting for a man's permission to exist. I had spent a decade seeking a seat at a table that was never meant for me, only to realize that the table was built on a foundation of my own labor. The silence of the restaurant wasn't lonely, it was sovereign. I looked at the empty chair across from me, the ghost of my father's smug face fading into the shadows of the candlelight. I didn't hate him anymore. Hate requires an emotional investment I was no longer willing to make. He was a man of the old world who had tried to cage a woman of the new one, and in doing so, he had taught me the most valuable lesson of all: power isn't given. It is taken, refined, and then guarded with absolute precision. The waiter arrived with my dinner, his movements fluid and unobtrusive. "Will there be anything else, Miss Harper?" "No, thank you," I said, lifting my glass. "I have everything I need." I took a sip of the wine, the dark fruit and oak settling on my palate. I thought about the thousands of employees whose livelihoods were now tied to my vision. I thought about the Aegis servers, humming in the dark, calculating the future. I thought about the little girl who had watched her father struggle and promised herself she would make him proud. I had kept that promise, but not in the way he expected. I had made the name Harper legendary, but I had done it by dismantling his world to build mine. I leaned back, the silk of my dress cool against my skin, and looked around the room. A year ago I had felt the walls closing in. Tonight the walls felt like they belonged to me. I wasn't just a guest in this room. I was the architect of the reality that existed outside its windows. I set the glass down with a soft, final clink against the white linen. My father had wanted a son to carry the name forward, believing that legacy was a matter of blood. He was wrong. Legacy is a matter of will. I finished my meal in peace, settled the bill with a card that didn't bear his signature, and walked out into the night. As I looked up at the Harper building, glowing like a beacon against the dark velvet of the sky, a single thought echoed in my mind, a final verdict on the 12 years it took to find my voice. I didn't grow up to inherit a seat at the table. I grew up to own the entire room. Thank you so much for spending your valuable time with Joanna's journey today. It truly means the world to me to share these stories with you. We've all felt like a placeholder at some point in our lives, but remember, your worth is not defined by those who fail to see it. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to fight for what was rightfully yours? Let's talk in the comments. If this story touched your heart, please consider joining our family by subscribing to Queen's Revenge. Together we reclaim our thrones.